Welcome to International Management, the podcast that breaks down the core challenges and strategies of global business. Based on Orlando Casabon's scripts for his international management class, each episode offers practical insights, clear strategies, real-world examples, and expert guidance to help you navigate complex global landscapes. For additional resources, visit casabon.com. Now, let's dive into the essentials of international management.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle international business. And trust me, you'll want to grab a notebook for this one. Imagine you're ready to take your company global. Exciting, right?
Definitely.
Where do you even start?
It's definitely not as simple as just setting up shop in a new country.
Exactly. That's why we're diving into excerpts from a business management course on this very topic. Plus some real-world cases to really make it all click. Think of this as your cheat sheet to navigating the wild world of international management.
I like that, a cheat sheet for going global.
Okay, so first things first. Before you even think about marketing or logistics, let's talk about the legal side. Every country has its own legal system, and if you're not prepared, it can be a minefield. What are some of the biggest differences businesses need to be aware of?
Well, you've got your common law systems, like in the US and the UK, where past court decisions really, really matter. Then there's civil law, common in many European countries, where the laws are all codified and spelled out in detail. And of course, we can't forget about Islamic law, which guides business practices in many Muslim-majority countries.
That's already a lot to keep track of. So how does this actually play out for businesses?
Let's say you're a software company in Britain, looking to license your tech to a company in the US. Both countries use common law, so you might end up digging through past legal rulings to see how similar agreements have been handled before.
So it's almost like legal archaeology, using the past to predict the future of your contract.
Exactly. But now imagine a French fashion house expanding into Japan. They're both civil law systems, so their contracts can actually be less detailed because many terms are already covered in the Japanese civil code.
Less paperwork is always a win in my book.
Absolutely. Now, let's say an Italian food company wants to sell halal products in Saudi Arabia. They need to understand Islamic dietary laws and get the proper certifications. It's not just about the legal document, it's about cultural sensitivity, too.
That's such a good point. It's not just about knowing the law. It's about respecting the culture behind it.
And then there's this concept called extraterritoriality, which can really throw businesses for a loop.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means that sometimes the laws of one country can reach beyond its borders.
So even if I'm following the rules in one country, I could still be breaking the law somewhere else.
It's possible, and that's why having a solid legal team who understand international law is crucial. For example, imagine a U.S. company doing business with a company in Iran. Even if their operations are outside the U.S., they could still be subject to U.S. sanctions.
Wow, so the legal landscape can get really complex really quickly. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about technology. You've got a cutting-edge product, you're ready to take it global. But how do you protect your innovations from copycats?
That's where appropriability comes in. It's all about a company's ability to profit from its technology by protecting it from competitors. Think patents, trademarks, copyrights, even trade secrets. They're all tools in the appropriability toolbox.
So it's about making sure no one else runs off with your brilliant idea.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The rules of the game can vary wildly between developed and developing countries. Developed nations often have strong intellectual property protection with strict patent laws and enforcement mechanisms.
So it's safe to assume that if I have a patent in the U.S., it's automatically protected everywhere else in the world.
Not quite. In developing economies, the focus might be more on accessing and adapting existing technologies, sometimes with fewer restrictions on imitation. There might be different requirements or even a greater emphasis on local innovation.
That's a good point. Our source material actually mentions a U.S. pharmaceutical company that developed a drug for a rare disease, but had their patent application rejected in a developing country because their standards for inventiveness were different. What a curveball. What happens in a situation like that?
It puts companies in a tough spot. They could try to sell the drug without patent protection, but that opens them up to generic competition. Or they could challenge the patent rejection through legal channels, which can be expensive and time-consuming. They have to weigh the potential profits against the risks involved.
So going global isn't just about scaling up. It's about understanding these nuances and adapting your strategy to each specific market.
Absolutely. And it's not just the legal and technological landscape you need to be aware of. There's also the ever-changing world of politics and economics to consider.
All right, let's dive into that then. The global stage can be pretty unpredictable, to say the least. So how can businesses assess the political and economic risks before they even think about setting up shop somewhere new?
That's a critical question. Let's start with political risk. It essentially refers to any government action or politically motivated event that could negatively impact a company's profitability.
Like what? Give us some examples of the kind of political nightmares businesses should be wary of.
We're talking about things like nationalization, where a government decides to take control of businesses or entire industries, especially in sectors they consider strategically important, like energy or natural resources.
Yikes. So you think you're investing in a stable market and suddenly the government swoops in and takes over.
It's happened before. And it's not the only political risk. There's also expropriation, where a government seizes assets, sometimes with compensation, but not always at a fair market value. And then there are events like civil wars, terrorism, political instability. All of these can wreak havoc on business operations.
That's a lot to consider. It sounds like businesses need to become political analysts as well as business leaders.
Well, it's not about becoming an expert in every political system, but it is about doing your due diligence. You can consult with experts, look at country risk ratings, and really dig into the history and current events of a country.
Our source material mentions a European mining company that learned this the hard way. They invested heavily in a mine in South America, only to have their investment nationalized when political unrest led to the government taking control of the entire mining industry.
That's a classic example of how political risk can materialize even when things seem stable on the surface. In hindsight, the company might have benefited from a deeper understanding of the underlying political tensions.
So it's not just about the initial investment. It's about constant monitoring and being prepared to adapt, even having an exit strategy in place if things take a turn for the worse.
Exactly. But political risk is only one part of the equation. We also need to talk about economic risk.
Right, because political stability doesn't necessarily guarantee economic stability.
Yeah.
How do businesses figure out if a country's economy is a safe bet? What should they be looking for?
It all boils down to a country's ability to meet its financial obligations. Think about factors like inflation, currency devaluation, debt levels, and government economic policies. Can they pay their debts? Are their economic policies sustainable?
So things like sky-high inflation or a sudden drop in the value of their currency would be big red flags.
Absolutely. Even seemingly small changes in economic policy, like a sudden tax hike, can significantly impact your bottom line.
Our source material highlights this with a case study about an Asian electronics company exporting to an Eastern European nation. They were doing great until that country got hit by a currency crisis. The value of their currency plummeted, and suddenly the electronics company was getting paid a fraction of what they were expecting.
That's a harsh lesson in the importance of understanding and mitigating economic risk.
So what can businesses do to protect themselves? Is it all about avoiding high-risk countries altogether?
Not necessarily. It's about diversification.
Yeah.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And when dealing with countries that might be economically volatile, there are ways to mitigate risk, like hedging currencies or structuring deals to minimize your exposure to sudden fluctuations.
All right, we've covered legal systems, technology protection, political risks, and economic uncertainty. It's a lot to keep track of. I'm ready to tackle the next layer, the impact of multinational corporations, those giants of international business. What kind of influence do these MNCs have on the global stage?
MNCs are a fascinating topic because their impact can be both positive and negative, and it often depends on how they choose to operate. Let's unpack that.
Perfect, let's do that.
Okay, so these MNCs, they're the big players in the global game, but are they a force for good or something we should be wary of?
Yeah, are they good or bad?
It's not so black and white. They can bring positive and negative impacts to the table. Think of it like this. They're not inherently good or bad. It really boils down to how they operate in a given country.
All right, let's break that down. Let's start with the potential positives. What are some ways MNCs can benefit the countries where they operate?
Well, sometimes they can raise the bar for everyone. Imagine a Western supermarket chain expanding into a new market. They often bring higher standards for things like food safety and hygiene. They might also introduce new ideas about supply chain management that local businesses can learn from.
So they're not just coming in and taking over, they're actually bringing something new to the table that can benefit the whole system.
Exactly. And we can't forget about job creation. MNCs often make big investments, building factories, offices, infrastructure. All of that creates jobs, not just for their own employees, but also for local construction companies, suppliers, service providers. It can have a real ripple effect on the local economy.
That's a compelling argument in their favor. But like you said, there's another side to this coin. What are some of the potential downsides of MNCs entering a market?
One of the big concerns is that they can sometimes outcompete local businesses, especially smaller ones that don't have the same resources or economies of scale. This can lead to job displacement, with local businesses shutting down and profits flowing out of the country instead of staying within the local community.
This is a classic trade-off. They might create some jobs, but it could also be eliminating others. It's not as simple as it seems on the surface.
Right, it's complex. And to really understand those complexities, it helps to look at some real-world examples. Our source material talks about a U.S. tech giant that opened a huge R&D center in India.
Oh, I remember reading about that. What happened? Was it a success story?
Well, on the one hand, it was a boon for the Indian tech sector. It brought in tons of high-skilled jobs, fostered partnerships with universities, and attracted other tech companies to the region. You can't deny the economic growth that came with it.
So far, so good. But I'm guessing there's a but coming.
You know it. There were some unintended consequences. Suddenly, you have this influx of highly paid tech workers, and that drove up housing costs in the area, making it harder for locals to afford to live there. Plus, local tech companies suddenly found themselves struggling to compete for talent because the U.S. giant was offering much higher salaries and perks.
So it created this kind of economic disparity, like a two-tiered system where some people benefited tremendously while others got pushed out.
That's one way to put it. And it raises a lot of questions about how to balance the benefits of foreign investment with the potential downsides for local communities.
It's a tricky situation. Are there any solutions? How can we encourage the positive aspects of MNCs while minimizing the negatives?
That's the million-dollar question. It's not easy, but I think awareness is a good starting point. MNCs need to be mindful of their impact and proactively work to minimize any negative consequences. Maybe that means investing in local workforce development programs so people have the skills to compete for those higher-paying jobs. Or it could mean sourcing materials from local suppliers whenever possible to support local businesses. Some even advocate for policies that specifically support small and medium-sized enterprises.
So it's about being a responsible global citizen, not just a profit-maximizing machine.
Exactly. And governments also have a role to play. They can implement policies that encourage MNCs to operate ethically and sustainably. Think about things like environmental regulations, fair labor practices, even requiring impact assessments before a big project is approved.
So it's a two-way street. MNCs need to step up and be responsible, and governments need to create a framework that incentivizes good behavior.
Right. It's a shared responsibility. And speaking of governments and their attempts to regulate MNCs, our source material mentioned restrictions on foreign ownership and profit repatriation. What's that all about?
I was wondering about that. It seems like some countries are a bit hesitant to let foreign companies have complete control.
Well, it's understandable, especially in developing economies. Governments want to protect their own interests. They might limit how much foreign ownership is allowed in certain industries, or restrict how much profit foreign companies can send back to their home countries.
It's like they're saying, come invest here, but we want to make sure those profits are being reinvested locally, benefiting our economy, not just yours.
That's the rationale. It's a way to safeguard national interests and prevent what's called capital flight, money flowing out of the country instead of staying invested there.
But doesn't that make foreign companies a bit hesitant to invest? I mean, if they can't take their profits out, what's the incentive?
It's definitely a factor that companies consider. It's a balancing act. Governments want to attract foreign investment, but also protect their own economies.
Our source material actually had an interesting example of this. A European energy company investing in wind power in Argentina, but facing restrictions on profit repatriation. What happens in a situation like that? Do they just throw their hands up in the air and walk away?
It usually involves a lot of negotiation and compromise. In that case, the European company likely had to engage with the Argentine government to find a solution that worked for both sides. Maybe that meant exploring different investment structures, reinvesting some of the profits locally, or even making a case for why their project deserves special consideration because of its contribution to Argentina's renewable energy goals. It requires a lot of creativity and diplomacy.
So international business is so much more than just understanding the market. It's about understanding the political landscape, the economic realities, the cultural nuances.
It's about recognizing that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to adapt your strategy to each specific context.
Absolutely. And that brings us to, wait a minute, are we already wrapping up our deep dive? Time flies when you're exploring the intricacies of international business.
It really does. But, even with all these complexities, there's something incredibly exciting about the idea of going global. It's like solving a giant puzzle, figuring out how to make all the pieces fit, how to adapt and thrive in all these different environments.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart, but for those who are up for the challenge, the rewards can be huge. It's about pushing boundaries, embracing new ideas, and ultimately contributing to a more interconnected world.
Beautifully put. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into international business, let's think about some key takeaways for our listener. Let's say they're about to take that leap onto the global stage. What advice would you give them?
Okay, imagine I'm about to pack my bags and launch my business internationally. What's the most important thing I need to remember?
First and foremost, do your homework. Don't just dip your toes in the water, dive in head first, but do it with your eyes wide open. Research, research, research. You need to understand the legal, political, economic, and technological landscape of any country you're targeting. And don't underestimate the importance of cultural awareness.
Right, because even if you have the best product in the world, if you don't understand the local customs and ways of doing business, you're going to run into trouble.
Exactly. Building relationships is key. Network, find trusted advisors who can guide you through the nuances of each market. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. The global landscape is constantly changing, so be prepared to adapt, be flexible, and never stop learning.
And if I can add a bit of personal advice, don't let the fear of the unknown hold you back. Yes, there are risks, but there are also incredible opportunities out there. So take a deep breath, trust your instincts, and go for it.
I love that. Embrace the adventure.
Well said. And as we leave our listener with a final thought-provoking question to consider, we focused a lot on the hard factors of international business, like laws, economics, technology. But what about the soft factors? Things like cultural nuances, understanding local customs, building trust. How might those intangible elements be just as crucial, if not more so, for success on the global stage?
That's a brilliant point to end on. Those soft factors, the human element of international business, are often overlooked, but they're absolutely essential.
All right, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into international business. We hope you've learned something new, gained some valuable insights, and maybe even sparked a dream of taking your own business global. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.